Deep within the silent, impenetrable forests of Maine, a ghost lived for decades. He left no trace, uttered no word, and vanished so completely from human society that he was declared legally dead. But Christopher Knight wasn't dead. He was meticulously carving out an impossible existence, becoming a master of stealth and survival. Outwitting every attempt to find him for 27 years. This is the incredible true story of the hermit who disappeared into the wilderness and the profound mystery of why. Welcome to the Dark Chapters. Vanishing without a word. Christopher Thomas Knight's disappearance from society was not a dramatic flight. But a quiet, almost imperceptible sliver into the wilderness that would ultimately consume 27 years of his life. Born in 1965 in Albion, Maine, Knight grew up in a seemingly normal, middle-class family. He was one of 6 children, and his childhood was unremarkable in most aspects. He attended local schools, showed an aptitude for electronics and mechanics, and by all accounts was a quiet, intelligent, but otherwise ordinary young man. There were no obvious signs in his early life that hinted at the extreme reclusiveness and radical self-exile that would later define him. After graduating from Lawrence High School in 1983, Knight took on various odd jobs, including working at a local store and as a technician. He was employed, maintained a driver's license, and was, by all appearances, integrated into society. He was known to be bright and capable, but also somewhat socially awkward and reserved. He had a few friends, but his social circle was never large. He was not a loner in a pathological sense, but he certainly gravitated towards solitude. This underlying inclination towards introspection and a certain detachment from conventional social norms would later become a defining characteristic. The precise catalyst for Knight's decision to vanish remains shrouded in mystery, even after his eventual capture. There was no traumatic event, no public scandal, no personal crisis that immediately preceded his disappearance. Unlike many who flee society due to debt, crime, or profound mental breaks, Knight simply decided to leave. His departure was meticulously planned and executed with an almost chilling lack of fanfare. In the summer of 1986, at the age of 20, Christopher Knight simply drove his Subaru out of his parents' driveway. He didn't tell anyone where he was going. He didn't say goodbye to his family, his friends, or his employers. He didn't leave a note, a letter, or any indication of his intentions. He simply drove away, leaving behind his entire life without a word of explanation. It was an act of complete and utter self-erasure, so profound that it took years for his family to even fully grasp the finality of his absence. He drove north into the vast, sparsely populated interior of Maine. His destination was not a specific place, but rather an idea: complete isolation and self-sufficiency in the wilderness. He chose a remote, heavily wooded area near North Pond in Rome, Maine, a region characterized by dense forests, numerous lakes, and very few permanent residents. This area was not a designated wilderness park, but rather a patchwork of private land, summer camps, and undeveloped forest, making it ideal for someone seeking to disappear unnoticed. Upon arriving at his chosen location, Knight deliberately abandoned his car. He drove it down a logging road, parked it discreetly in a dense thicket, and left the keys on the dashboard. He took with him only the absolute essentials: a tent, a sleeping bag, some basic camping gear, and very little food. He carried no map, no compass, at least not initially, and no advanced survival tools. His initial foray into the wilderness was surprisingly ill-prepared for someone planning a long-term existence, suggesting an impulsive element to his final break. Despite the methodical nature of his disappearance, his initial days and weeks in the woods would have been a baptism by fire. Maine's wilderness is beautiful but unforgiving, with harsh winters, abundant wildlife, and challenging terrain. Knight, though intelligent and mechanically inclined, had no prior extensive wilderness survival training. He relied on his wits, his observational skills, and a steep learning curve to adapt to his new environment. He would have faced immediate challenges, finding reliable sources of clean water, building adequate shelter, foraging for food, and contending with the pervasive cold and dampness. The complete absence of any communication from Knight baffled and distressed his family. Initially, they might have assumed he was simply traveling or needed some time alone, as young men sometimes do. However, as weeks turned into months and months into years, their concern escalated into alarm. They filed missing person reports, but there was no trace of him. His bank accounts remained untouched, his driver's license unrenewed. It was as if he had simply ceased to exist. Law enforcement investigations yielded no clues, no leads, and no indication of foul play. He was just gone. Eventually, after years of agonizing silence and fruitless searches, Christopher Knight was presumed dead by his family and the authorities. He was officially declared legally deceased. For all intents and purposes, the man named Christopher Thomas Knight had vanished from all records, wiped clean from the societal ledger. This legal death mirrored his actual chosen existence, a life without identity, without a presence in the world of people. What drove him to this extreme act of self-exile remains the central enigma of his story. He later stated that he had no reason for leaving, no specific event or grievance. He simply felt a deep, inexplicable urge to be alone. He yearned for ultimate solitude, a desire so profound that it compelled him to sever every tie to civilization. His vanishing act was not a rejection of specific people, but a rejection of society itself, its demands, its expectations, and its constant cacophony. He sought a purity of existence untainted by human interaction, a silence so complete that only the sounds of the forest would remain. His disappearance was not an escape from something, but an escape to an idea of absolute, unburdened freedom. This radical act of vanishing without a word set the stage for one of the most astonishing stories of long-term isolation in modern history, transforming an ordinary young man into the legendary North Pond Hermit. Having vanished without a trace, Christopher Knight embarked on an existence of unparalleled solitude, a life lived entirely off the grid in the dense woods of Rome, Maine. For the next 27 years, from 1986 until his capture in 2013, he lived alone in the wilderness, becoming a phantom, a whisper, the legendary North Pond Hermit. His chosen home was a meticulously constructed campsite, tucked deep within a secluded, swampy area of the woods, far from any established trails or human dwellings. His primary shelter was a simple, camouflaged tent, which he frequently replaced over the decades as it wore out. This tent was not a large, comfortable dwelling, but rather a minimalist structure designed for concealment and basic protection from the elements. He set up his camp in an incredibly remote and difficult-to-access location, surrounded by thick brush and dense tree cover, making it virtually invisible from the air or ground. He never built a permanent cabin or anything that would leave a significant footprint, understanding that permanence invited discovery. Life in the Maine wilderness presented formidable challenges, particularly the harsh, unforgiving winters. Temperatures could plummet far below freezing, and heavy snowfalls were common. To survive the cold, Knight developed ingenious strategies. He would line his tent with layers of tarpaulins and blankets, creating insulation. He relied on a small propane-fueled heater for warmth, which he meticulously conserved, understanding that every bit of fuel was precious and had to be acquired through stealth. He often spent days huddled in his sleeping bag, minimizing movement to conserve body heat, a practice akin to a bear's hibernation. The bitter cold was a constant threat, and surviving it required immense discipline and resilience. Water was acquired from the surrounding lakes and streams. For cooking and occasional cleaning, he would collect rainwater or melt snow. His food sources were entirely dependent on his ingenious and illegal methods of acquisition. He never hunted or fished, a surprising choice for a long-term hermit, primarily because he lacked the necessary equipment, rifles, fishing gear, and perhaps a desire to avoid creating noise that might have instead. His sustenance came entirely from stealing, a critical aspect of his survival that would eventually lead to his downfall. His daily routine was a finely tuned dance with nature and stealth. He lived by the sun, waking at dawn and sleeping with dusk, adjusting his internal clock to the natural rhythms of the forest. He became intimately familiar with the local flora and fauna, understanding animal movements, seasonal changes, and the subtle shifts in weather patterns. He maintained a meticulously clean camp, burying all his waste and leaving no garbage behind, an obsessive habit that helped him remain undetectable. Any trace of human presence could lead to discovery, so he became a master of leave no trace, living. Solitude was not just his chosen state, but also his greatest challenge. For 27 years, Knight rarely spoke a word. His only brief human interactions were the fleeting moments during his stealthy raids. He had no conversations, no emotional exchanges, no social connections whatsoever. This level of sustained isolation is almost unfathomable for most human beings, who are inherently social creatures. He later described the experience as incredibly difficult, admitting that he sometimes suffered from profound loneliness. The absence of conversation meant his verbal skills deteriorated, and he often struggled to form sentences after his capture. The silence became both a comfort and a burden, a defining feature of his existence. To combat the intellectual stagnation that might accompany such isolation, Knight read voraciously. He acquired books through his pilfering, reading everything from philosophy and history to dictionaries and encyclopedias. These stolen books became his window to the outside world, his only connection to human thought and discourse. He described them as his companions, providing mental stimulation and a sense of connection to intellectual life even as he lived in complete physical isolation. He famously told his captors that he learned about world events and modern technology from newspapers and magazines he stole, demonstrating his continued, albeit passive, engagement with society. His existence required an almost superhuman level of stealth and awareness. He never lit fires, as smoke could give away his position. He moved through the woods with an uncanny ability to navigate unseen, like a ghost. He developed an acute sense of hearing and observation, able to detect human presence long before he was detected. He learned to distinguish the sounds of animals from human footsteps, the rustle of leaves from an approaching vehicle. He became intimately familiar with the routines of the local residents, observing their patterns of movement and their habits, which he then exploited for his survival raids. Despite occasional sightings, which quickly became local legends of a hermit or monster, Knight managed to evade capture for nearly 3 decades. Local residents, wary of trespassers and often armed, would sometimes glimpse a fleeting figure, but he was always too quick, too silent, too well camouflaged to be definitively identified or apprehended. Law enforcement periodically searched the area, but without concrete evidence or a clear starting point. Their efforts were always futile. Knight's meticulous camp hygiene and his ability to leave virtually no trace were key to his long-term evasion. His mental state, forged in the crucible of extreme isolation, underwent profound changes. He became hypervigilant, constantly aware of his surroundings, always on guard for potential threats. His thinking became intensely focused on survival, simplifying his existence to the most fundamental needs. He spent his days focused on gathering resources, maintaining his camp, and avoiding detection. This constant struggle for survival occupied his entire mental landscape, leaving little room for abstract thought or emotional complexity beyond the immediate demands of his environment. Living alone in the woods for 27 years fundamentally altered Christopher Knight. He was no longer the somewhat awkward young man who had driven away in 1986. He was a creature of the forest, a master of survival and evasion, a man whose identity had become inextricably linked to his solitude. His choice to live this way and his remarkable success at it for so long made him a compelling, enigmatic figure, challenging conventional notions of human needs and societal integration. His life in the woods was a profound experiment in self-imposed exile, pushing the boundaries of what a human being could endure alone in the wilderness. However, this remarkable self-sufficiency came at a price, entirely dependent on his clandestine raids into the very civilization he had abandoned. Christopher Knight's 27 years of solitude in the Maine woods, while a testament to human endurance, was not achieved through complete self-sufficiency. Paradoxically, his hermetic existence was entirely dependent on the very civilization he had abandoned. He survived by stealing. This clandestine, persistent pilfering was not a mere convenience, but a critical, non-negotiable aspect of his daily life, providing him with essential supplies he could not otherwise acquire or produce in the wilderness. Knight quickly realized that true, absolute self-sufficiency in the harsh Maine climate was virtually impossible without extensive prior training, specialized equipment, and the cultivation of land, all of which he lacked. He did not hunt, fish, or grow crops. His chosen method of survival was to become a nocturnal phantom, moving silently through the woods under the cover of darkness, targeting remote cabins, camps, and businesses for the provisions he needed. This strategy minimized his footprint and avoided direct confrontation, but it made him a persistent, if unseen, presence in the local community. His primary targets were the numerous summer camps and isolated cabins dotting the North Pond area. These seasonal dwellings, often unoccupied for months during the off-season, provided a relatively safe and consistent source of supplies. Knight meticulously studied the routines of the owners, observing their arrival and departure patterns, their security measures, and the contents of their properties. He became a master of observation, a silent watcher in the woods, learning the rhythms of human life from a distance. The items he stole were not luxuries, but necessities for survival in the wilderness. Food was paramount. He prioritized non-perishable items that could be stored and consumed over time, such as canned goods, dried foods, coffee, and powdered milk. He was particularly fond of snacks and sweets, simple comforts in his austere existence. Beyond food, he regularly took propane tanks for his small heater, which was vital for surviving the brutal Maine winter. Batteries were also essential for his flashlight and radio. Other stolen items included clothing, boots, and rudimentary tools that could be used for camp maintenance or to break into cabins. He also took books, newspapers, and magazines, which served as his sole connection to the outside world and a means to keep his intellect stimulated. Knight's methods of breaking and entering were sophisticated and refined over years of practice. He rarely used force, preferring stealth and cunning. He would patiently wait for the deepest hours of the night, often operating during storms when visibility was low and sounds were muffled. He learned to pick locks, bypass alarm systems, and quietly force windows or doors without leaving obvious signs of entry. His movements were precise and deliberate, designed to minimize noise and leave as little trace as possible. He would enter a cabin, grab only what he needed, and disappear back into the forest before dawn. This meticulousness allowed him to evade detection for decades. The sheer frequency and localized nature of his thefts eventually created a growing sense of unease and frustration among the local residents and property owners. The phenomenon of the North Pond Hermit became a local legend, whispered about with a mix of fear, annoyance, and reluctant fascination. For years, people reported missing items from their cabins, food disappearing, and propane tanks vanishing. While many assumed it was just local vandals or opportunistic thieves, the persistent, pattern-like nature of the thefts, particularly in such a remote area, hinted at something more unusual. Local law enforcement, primarily Maine State Police and wardens, were aware of the hermit problem, but their efforts to catch him were repeatedly thwarted. Knight was incredibly elusive. He never left fingerprints, rarely dropped any personal items, and his camp was so well hidden that no one ever stumbled upon it. He used the dense, swampy terrain to his advantage, melting into the landscape with an almost supernatural ability. Searches, often involving tracking dogs and aerial surveillance, yielded no results. The terrain was simply too vast and too difficult for consistent human pursuit. He was a master of evasion, anticipating search patterns and adapting his movements to remain invisible. The impact of Knight's thefts on the local community, while not financially ruinous, was psychologically unsettling. Residents felt violated, their sense of security eroded by the invisible intruder who seemed to know their every habit. They installed more robust locks, alarm systems, and even motion sensor lights, but Knight often found ways around them. Some installed game cameras, hoping to catch a glimpse of the phantom thief, but he was always too wary, too quick, or too well camouflaged. The sheer longevity of the thefts, stretching over nearly 3 decades, made him a figure of myth, almost a local boogeyman. Despite the fear and frustration he caused, Knight held a peculiar code. He claimed he never stole from primary residences where people lived year-round, only from seasonal camps and businesses. He also claimed he only took what he absolutely needed, never more. While this was his justification, it did not diminish the impact of his actions on those he victimized. His survival was literally at their expense. This moral compromise was the necessary evil of his chosen existence. His long reign as the North Pond Hermit finally came to an end due to an unforeseen circumstance and a change in his routine. For 27 years he had managed to evade capture, but his luck eventually ran out. His consistent need for supplies led him to repeatedly target the same local store, the Pine Tree Camp for Special Needs Children, which was an ironically vulnerable target due to its remote location and reliance on simple security. He had raided it over 40 times. This repeated targeting, however, increased his exposure and the authorities' focus on this specific location. On April 4, 2013, Knight's long run of stealth came to an abrupt halt. He was caught during a routine raid on the Pine Tree Camp. The camp had been experiencing persistent break-ins, and Maine Game Warden Sergeant Terry Hughes, a veteran officer, had installed a hidden motion sensor in the camp kitchen, a subtle yet effective piece of technology that Knight had not anticipated. When the sensor was triggered in the early morning hours, Hughes was alerted. He arrived at the scene and found Knight emerging from the camp kitchen with a backpack full of stolen food. The capture was swift and anticlimactic. Knight offered no resistance, simply stating, "I guess I'm done." After 27 years of absolute solitude, his life as the North Pond Hermit had ended not in a dramatic chase, but in a quiet, almost resigned apprehension. The identity of the legendary hermit was finally revealed. Christopher Thomas Knight, the young man who had vanished without a trace in 1986, presumed dead. His survival, utterly dependent on his stealthy acts of theft, had finally caught up with him, thrusting him back into the very civilization he had meticulously avoided for nearly 3 decades. His long silence was broken, and the world was about to hear his extraordinary story. After 27 years of living as a phantom in the Maine wilderness, Christopher Knight's extraordinary run as the North Pond Hermit came to an abrupt and anticlimactic end on April 4, 2013. His capture was not the result of a massive manhunt or a dramatic confrontation, but rather a meticulously planned, patient stakeout by a single, dedicated game warden. For years, the remote Pine Tree Camp for Special Needs Children in Rome, Maine, had been a frequent target of the elusive hermit. The camp, nestled deep within the woods, offered a convenient and relatively vulnerable source of supplies for Knight. He had raided it over 40 times, relying on its seasonal vacancy and simpler security measures. However, his repeated visits made the camp a focal point for authorities, particularly for Maine Game Warden Sergeant Terry Hughes. Hughes, a veteran officer with extensive knowledge of the local terrain and a keen understanding of criminal behavior, was determined to put an end to the persistent break-ins. Hughes had spent considerable time and effort investigating the string of thefts, developing a profile of the elusive perpetrator. He surmised that the thief was incredibly disciplined, skilled in stealth, and operating with a deep knowledge of the local environment. Recognizing that traditional patrols and casual searches were futile against such a cunning individual, Hughes employed a more strategic approach. He installed a hidden motion sensor inside the camp's kitchen, a subtle piece of technology designed to detect any unauthorized entry without alerting the intruder. This was the technological trap that Christopher Knight, accustomed to outsmarting simpler security measures for decades, did not anticipate. In the early morning hours of April 4, 2013, the hidden motion sensor in the Pine Tree Camp kitchen was triggered. Sergeant Hughes, who was closely monitoring the alerts, immediately responded. He arrived at the scene quietly, positioned himself, and waited. Soon, Christopher Knight emerged from the camp kitchen, his backpack laden with stolen food, unaware that his long reign of undetected pilfering had finally reached its end. The capture was remarkably uneventful. Hughes confronted Knight, who offered no resistance. There was no struggle, no attempt to flee. After 27 years of living completely off the grid, constantly on guard, Knight simply looked at the warden and, with an air of resignation, stated, "I guess I'm done." It was a quiet surrender, born not of physical defeat, but perhaps of a profound weariness from decades of relentless vigilance and extreme solitude. The immediate challenge for Sergeant Hughes and other responding officers was to identify the man they had just captured. He had no identification on him, no wallet, no driver's license, no fingerprints on file, and no known connection to any missing persons reports in recent memory. He was, to all official records, a ghost. When questioned about his identity, the captured man initially provided only vague and evasive answers. His verbal communication skills were notably diminished, a direct consequence of nearly 3 decades without human conversation. He struggled to form full sentences, his speech often halting and fragmented, a stark testament to his extreme isolation. However, through persistent but patient questioning, law enforcement officers were able to piece together fragments of information. The man eventually revealed his name, Christopher Thomas Knight. He provided details about his family and his hometown of Albion, Maine. These details, though seemingly ordinary, were crucial starting points for investigators. The process of confirming his identity was painstaking. Maine State Police detectives began by checking missing persons databases, cross-referencing names and birth dates. The sheer length of his disappearance made this difficult. After 27 years, he had been legally presumed dead. It took several days of diligent police work, contacting old school records, and eventually reaching out to distant relatives to definitively confirm that the man in custody was indeed Christopher Thomas Knight, who had vanished from his family's life in 1986. The revelation of his identity sent shockwaves through his family. For 27 years, they had lived with the agonizing uncertainty of his disappearance, eventually coming to terms with his presumed death. To suddenly learn that he was alive and had been living as a hermit just miles from civilization was an overwhelming experience. His mother, Mary Knight, expressed profound relief, mixed with disbelief, and a multitude of unanswered questions. His brother, Mark Knight, who had spent years grappling with his brother's disappearance, confirmed his identity to authorities. The family was left to reconcile the quiet, studious boy they remembered with the legendary North Pond hermit who had seemingly vanished into thin air for decades. As news of the capture and identity reveal spread, the story of Christopher Knight exploded onto the national and international stage. The media descended upon the quiet town of Rome, Maine, captivated by the almost unbelievable tale of a man who had successfully evaded detection for so long. Knight became an instant celebrity, a subject of intense fascination and widespread debate. News outlets dissected every detail of his capture and his previous life, attempting to unravel the mystery of why. During interrogations, Knight provided unprecedented insight into his life in isolation. He calmly described his meticulously hidden campsite, his methods of survival, and his techniques for evading detection. He explained how he never lit fires, always cleaned up his waste, and learned to move through the woods like a shadow. He detailed his nocturnal raids on cabins and camps, admitting to stealing food, propane, batteries, and books. He claimed that his thefts were solely for survival, as he lacked the means or desire to hunt or fish. His matter-of-fact recounting of his existence, devoid of apparent remorse for the thefts, but filled with a profound yearning for solitude, intrigued psychologists and the public alike. The world grappled with the implications of Knight's story. How could someone live for so long without human contact? What did it reveal about the human need for connection versus the desire for ultimate freedom? His case challenged conventional notions of mental health and social integration. While some viewed him as a modern-day Thoreau, an individual who bravely opted out of societal norms, others saw a profoundly disturbed individual, or simply a thief who had avoided justice for too long. Christopher Knight was charged with numerous counts of burglary and theft, offenses that, accumulated over 27 years, could have resulted in a lengthy prison sentence. However, the unique circumstances of his case and the public fascination it generated presented a dilemma for the legal system. The capture and identity reveal of Christopher Knight was more than just the apprehension of a burglar. It was the unearthing of a living legend, a profound human mystery that compelled the world to look inward and question the boundaries of human solitude and the very definition of freedom. His long silence was broken, and his impossible story was finally ready to be told. Christopher Knight's 27-year odyssey of self-imposed isolation ended with his capture on April 4, 2013, abruptly thrusting him back into the bewildering complexities of the civilization he had so meticulously abandoned. His return was not a joyful homecoming, but a disorienting plunge into a world he no longer recognized, a world that now viewed him with a mix of fascination, judgment, and scientific curiosity. After his capture, Knight was taken to the Kennebec County Jail. The initial days and weeks of his incarceration were a profound shock to his system. For nearly 3 decades, his environment had been the silent, wild forest. Now, he was confined to a small, sterile cell, surrounded by artificial light, constant noise, and the pervasive presence of other people. The transition from absolute solitude to forced proximity with dozens of strangers was disorienting. He reportedly struggled with the sensory overload, the incessant sounds, and the lack of privacy. His verbal communication skills, severely atrophied from years of disuse, posed a significant challenge. He spoke slowly, sometimes struggling to form complete sentences or find the right words. His voice, unaccustomed to sustained conversation, was often raspy. This difficulty in articulation compounded the strangeness of his situation, making it harder for him to express his thoughts and feelings to his interrogators, and later, to the public. He had to relearn the basic rhythms of human interaction, a testament to the profound impact of his long isolation. Legally, Knight faced numerous charges of burglary and theft, accumulated over his 27 years of pilfering from cabins and camps. The sheer volume of his crimes meant he faced a potentially lengthy prison sentence. However, the unprecedented nature of his case, coupled with immense public and media interest, led to a unique legal process. District Attorney Megan Maloney recognized that the motivation behind his crimes was not malice or profit, but pure survival. While she acknowledged the impact on the victims of his thefts, she also sought a resolution that considered the extraordinary circumstances of his life. In October 2013, Christopher Knight pleaded guilty to 13 counts of burglary and theft. He was sentenced to 7 months in jail, with credit for time served since his April arrest, a fine of $2,000, 0 cents, and an order to pay restitution of $1,800, 0 cents, to his victims. Crucially, he was also ordered to participate in a special Veterans Court program which focused on rehabilitation and treatment rather than solely punishment, typically reserved for military veterans struggling with PTSD or other issues. The judge acknowledged the unique psychological aspects of Knight's case, stating that he wanted to ensure Knight received the help he needed to reintegrate into society. This relatively lenient sentence, given the number of crimes, reflected the court's recognition of the highly unusual circumstances. The process of reintegration was perhaps the most daunting challenge for Knight. He was released from jail in December 2013, having served his sentence. He was placed on probation and required to report regularly to a probation officer. His family, though still grappling with the why of his disappearance, welcomed him back into their lives, offering a cautious path to reestablish connections. However, the chasm of 27 years of separation and the profound psychological changes he had undergone made genuine reunion complex. Public fascination with Christopher Knight remained intense. Journalists, psychologists, and documentary filmmakers clamored to understand his story. He became the subject of extensive media coverage, a living enigma. Psychologists and sociologists debated the nature of extreme isolation, the human need for society, and the potential for an individual to simply opt out. His case provided invaluable, albeit ethically complex, insights into the limits of human solitude and adaptation. Perhaps the most significant examination of Knight's experience came through journalist Michael Finkel's book, The Stranger in the Woods: The Extraordinary Story of the Last True Hermit. Finkel spent dozens of hours interviewing Knight in jail, meticulously documenting his story. Through these interviews, Knight provided glimpses into his internal world during his years of isolation. He spoke of the profound loneliness he endured, the spiritual experiences he sometimes felt in nature, and the immense difficulty of maintaining vigilance against discovery. He reiterated that he left society simply because he felt compelled to be alone, not as a rejection of specific people, but of societal demands. He described how his identity as Christopher Knight had slowly dissolved, replaced by a pure, unburdened existence of simple survival. His return to civilization was fraught with challenges. The very comforts of modern life were alienating. He found the noise, the crowds, the constant flow of information, and the digital world to be overwhelming. He struggled with basic social interactions, the unspoken rules of etiquette, and the necessity of engaging with others after so many years of silence. Adjusting to structured routines, jobs, and financial responsibilities after living entirely outside such systems was immensely difficult. He needed to learn how to shop for food in a store, how to navigate traffic, and how to communicate with people in everyday settings. These mundane tasks, second nature to most, were monumental hurdles for him. Knight initially moved back in with his mother, a slow and tentative process of re-establishing a relationship after more than a quarter-century of complete absence. He largely avoided the public eye, seeking to regain the anonymity he had lost. His probation requirements ensured he remained tethered to society, preventing him from slipping back into the woods. He took on odd jobs, demonstrating his mechanical aptitude, but struggled to hold down steady employment due to his unique circumstances and discomfort with social interaction. The long-term impact of his isolation on his psyche remains a subject of continued speculation and study. While he did not display overt signs of severe mental illness, His profound withdrawal and difficulty reintegrating pointed to the deep psychological scars left by his unique, chosen life. He was a man out of time, a living paradox, who embodied the ultimate pursuit of freedom while simultaneously being trapped by the very limitations of human nature. Christopher Knight's return to civilization concluded one of the most astonishing human experiments in modern history. His story became a powerful meditation on the balance between independence and connection, the allure of solitude, and the fundamental human need for community. He may have vanished without a word, lived as a phantom, and survived by stealth, but his rediscovery forced the world to ask profound questions about the nature of humanity itself, leaving behind a legacy that continues to resonate far beyond the quiet woods of Maine. His extraordinary journey from total disappearance to reluctant reemergence serves as a unique and compelling narrative of what happens when a single individual pushes the boundaries of isolation to its absolute extreme. Christopher Knight's extraordinary 27-year disappearance and his reluctant return challenge us to reconsider the very essence of human connection, freedom, and self-sufficiency. His story is a unique window into the depths of human psychology and the profound impact of ultimate solitude. What do you believe motivated Christopher Knight's radical choice, and what does his reintegration tell us about the human spirit's adaptability? Share your thoughts and reflections in the comments below. Let's explore this compelling human enigma together. If this incredible tale of isolation and an impossible return to civilization captivated you, please give this video a like, subscribe to The Dark Chapters for more profound stories that delve into the boundaries of human experience, and ring the notification bell so you never miss another journey into the lives of the truly unique. And don't forget to share this video with someone who is fascinated by the mysteries of human nature.